Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Suburban Homesteader, Wyoming, Arizona. This is my normal night sky when we go for a walk. Now, I took a photograph of it, but you can see the palm trees. It's kind of fun. I tell you, kind of fun. So, hello, everybody. And a few of you girls are in so far. Linda's in, Julie's in. Lazy Bunny Homestead, how are ya? Jeannie is here. Hello, Carol. How are ya? And Ann with Little Frenchie in Big Texas. Hello. Cheryl, hello. How are ya? And it's going to be a fun night tonight. You know, I always keep my lives about a half hour, so it'll be a lot of talking because we are talking bread. This week is Thanksgiving, and who doesn't love homemade bread or those homemade rolls? It's fabulous when it comes to any of the holidays. Now, we like homemade bread anytime, or cinnamon rolls, or whatever I feel like baking. Joe is always happy to eat. And hello, Katie. And Shawnee is in here too. Well, hello, hello. Oh, look at here. We will be visiting Arizona in a couple weeks. Are you going to be by me? Will you be by Yuma? If you are, we could meet up. I don't know what part of Arizona you're going to, but send me a message and let me know. And Christine is here. Hello, how are ya? And Jeannie says, love me some fresh hot bread. That is true, so true. And sometimes it's just so hard not to slice that loaf of bread when it first comes out of the oven. But I'm going to tell you in a little bit why you really shouldn't do that. Now, do I pull apart a bun sometimes when it comes right out of the oven? Have I sliced bread sometimes when it just came out of the oven? Yes. But we're going to talk about why you really shouldn't do that. If you're going to not eat all that bread in the next 24 hours. But I hope that you guys have tried making bread. If you haven't, maybe this will give you some ideas. I would make 2 loaves a day when my 5 were growing up. Oh, yeah, I can totally understand that. I mean, they go through bread like crazy. And I mean, I'm not sure my grandmother ever bought bread. Now, we might have bought bread when we came to visit because we were going through so much bread with the kids. But she always made homemade bread. And then she'd have that homemade strawberry jam on top of it. It was just one of those memories when I was little that was just so fabulous. Now, Shawnee wants to know, does using my bread machine count? It certainly counts. Now, sometimes people will use a bread machine and all they'll do is use it while it's mixing, and they don't actually bake in the bread machine. Other people do it the whole time. Have I owned a bread machine in my life? I have. I didn't use it very long though. It was just, the loaves were too small for me when we had all the kids, and it was just something I would rather touch with my hands. It's like gardening without gloves. I just need that feel in there. See, lots of people are using it, Shawnee. They use their bread machine. And Cheryl says, love fresh baked sourdough bread. Oh, yeah. Made breadcrumbs for dressing. Oh, so good. I have to totally agree with you. My bread maker makes a perfect bread in an hour. See, that is a benefit of a bread machine. And a lot of times if you're limited in time, it's the way to go. You put it in there, it does all the mixing, it bakes it, everything is, you don't have to do anything. It's really, it can be a perfect situation for a lot of people. And Lynn, my friend, is in here. Hello, Lynn. How are ya? If you see a little S after people's names, that means they are a member. I have rye loaves in the freezer. I was going to dry out some for stuffing. Perfect. Because it makes a great stuffing. Homemade bread makes a great stuffing. Now tonight, oh, and Jake is here. Hey, Jake, how are ya? And if I missed anybody in the chat, please just make another comment so that I can say hi to you. I'm going to say my top 10 tricks about making bread. Now, some things we just have to, you just have to know before you start making the bread. And Lynn's grandson was wearing her hat that I had made for her. Jackson gave my hat back to me. That is awesome. I made sourdough bread, but want to try more. See, and this is the thing. When you start making bread, my theory is when you're first making bread, is you should make that same recipe, as long as you like that recipe, over and over and over again. What it does is you get the feel of the bread. And so your fingers know if it needs more flour or if it has enough flour, and it gets you that feel of how much kneading you need to put it when you're baking that bread. Now, when you start making bread, there's a lot of different recipes. Some of them are very complicated, some are very simple. I think you should start with a simple recipe. Like, there are recipes and all you're putting in there, I wrote it down so I didn't forget: yeast, oil, sugar, salt, water, and flour. Simple. Now, some people and some recipes, they will have flour, salt, sugar, yeast, and they mix it all together, and then they're adding the water. I never do that. The reason why I don't do that is, one, I don't want the salt interacting with the yeast yet. Sometimes it can make it so the yeast doesn't proof like it should. And so that's just something I don't do. Carol says that she was gifted a bread machine years ago, used it very little, gave it to a neighbor. See, and I bet you your neighbor loves it because there are some great bread machines out there. I did put a link in the description for a couple different kinds of yeast that I think are really good. I've used them multiple times. I mean, in fact, back home, the very first one, the fast acting yeast, I use all the time, every single time, and it stores really well in my freezer. A lot of times they'll say that you can only store yeast in your freezer for 3 months. Well, I always buy the pound bags of the yeast, and it's all vacuum sealed. And I have literally had it in for months and months. And then when I've opened it, it has been perfectly fine, and I've used the whole bag, and it's been great. Now, you can make it all by hand. You can make it with your bread machine. But one of the things you need to remember is that your water, and this is real important, some people will say 120 to 130 degrees. Probably more recipes will say 110 to 120 degrees. It should really feel like body temperature. A little, it shouldn't be hot because that can destroy the yeast. If your water is too hot, you can have things go wrong. Maybe it doesn't it doesn't rise the way you want it to. That can be one of the reasons why it doesn't. Linda says that's a lot of yeast. It really isn't a lot of yeast. If you are making bread all the time, you're making cinnamon rolls, we're making pizza dough. We're just doing a lot of things that I use the yeast. And so one of my very first things to say, it's not one of the tips really, is your water. Don't get it too hot. And that can, because I have talked to a lot of people, and I'll ask them, well, how hot was your water? Well, I don't know. It's just hot out of the tap. It's just too hot. So it's just something that you'll have to be aware of. Now, do I store my yeast? Always in the freezer. Now, there are the vacuum packs, it's all vacuum sealed. You could put that in your pantry. I just always have a full 1 pound bag in the freezer, and then the one that I'm using. So probably my number one first tip is you got to know about kneading your bread. So you've mixed it all up. One of the key things that I think that people don't do, so this is why I put it at my first tip, is that they don't knead it long enough. Now, one of the reasons that I've found when I've talked to people is they're doing it on their kitchen counter. Well, a lot of times your kitchen counter is a little higher than what your table would be. And so when they're pressing it, they're kneading it, their arms are really getting tired. And the older you get, the more that happens. But if you do it on your table, I use a pastry mat underneath. You have a little more leverage. And you should knead it around 10 minutes. The idea is that when you have that dough in your hands, you should be able to pull it apart anywhere from 2 to 4 inches before it breaks. Then it's very elastic, and that's really a great way to do it. And D. Blake says, oh, look at that, beautiful British Columbia, Canada. Hello, welcome in. I have been making sourdough since March 2022, and the things have really improved, but I never stop learning. And that is a key. That's why earlier I said, pick a recipe and make that over and over and over again. It's like when you make pie dough. If you haven't made a pie dough for a while, it just doesn't turn out quite the same as if you've been making pies, every couple weeks. You get that feel, and that's what happens with the dough. You get that feel. And so just remember, for tip number 1, when it's all incorporated, you got everything, you should be able to stretch that dough easily 2 to 4 inches before it rips. And that's just a little key that really helps when you're doing that. Sandi, that was many years ago when bread machines first came out. I bet the newer machines are even better. Oh, I would bet so too. I think, I would bet that is just totally cool. Julie says, I get on a short step stool when I'm kneading. I have done that before because I have stuff on my table, or Joe's doing something on the table. So I have this little stool thing. It's probably 8 inches. And I'll stand on that and knead it because I need that leverage. And look who's here in the kitchen with Karen. Hello, girl. She says, oh, I've been craving some hot, fresh bread. Oh, girl, you got to make it. It is Thanksgiving time. It's the holiday times. Just so fabulous. Okay, tip number 2. My tip is, no matter what the recipe tells you, I always mix my water, my sugar, and my yeast together. And then I just let it sit 10 minutes. And the yeast starts eating on the sugar. It starts to activate. It starts getting bubbly. And then I start adding the other ingredients. I don't want to add my salt with my yeast because depending on the amount of salt you put in there, it can do things so the yeast doesn't activate like it would. It is a literal chemical reaction that is happening. I'm not telling you not to put salt in because you need the salt in your bread for a good taste. I just happen to let that yeast start working before I do it. Julie says, it's called the window test. You should be able to stretch it thin enough to look through it. It's interesting how elastic dough can get when you've worked it. And really 10 minutes is really not that long. Failed pie crust today. Started sourdough pie crust. Hopefully it will be amazing. Sure, I would just keep trying because no matter what we do, sometimes things are not going to work out when we're baking. It doesn't matter how long you have been baking. You're going to have those days that it's just going to happen. Tip number 3. My tip number 3 is letting, when you have it all mixed in, you've kneaded it, you put it in the grease bowl. I like to cover mine with a cloth. Some people will cover theirs with saran wrap. Totally up to you. But I really think a lot of times we don't let it rise long enough. It should be rising probably an hour, hour and a half. Now, of course, this isn't when we're using the bread machine. The bread machine is going to do everything for you because it's heating it. It's doing all this stuff for it. But if you let that rise at hour and a half. It is, in fact, if you didn't have time to finish it, you could literally put your bread dough in the refrigerator overnight and let it come back out and let it warm up and rise for you. There's options. But you just want it to rise, and when it's doing that chemical reaction, more flavors are going into the breads. And then depending on the flours that you're using, that you really want those flavors to just meld all through that bread. And so it's just something that you want to do. My pie crust won't work since I moved higher up in the mountain. Interesting. Shani, you might have to play with more or less flour to see if that helps it. What is the difference between active dry yeast and rapid rise yeast? There's not a lot of difference. They're both, one will do it a little bit faster. There's also what they call, some people call it wet yeast or fresh yeast when it's a liquid. Well, kind of a liquid. It's not dry. And that's a whole different way of making bread, and the flavors can be really intense. But you could use either one of the active dry yeast or the rapid rise yeast in any recipe. One's just going to be a little bit faster than the other. I've used both of them. Have I been able to tell the difference taste wise? No. It's hard to tell how much difference it makes in the rising time because there are factors. How much humidity you have in your house, how warm your kitchen is. And that can make a difference too. It could be, say, instead of like the perfect temperature in your kitchen when you're making bread is 70 degrees. Say it's 75 in your kitchen that day. It's going to be different when it rises. Say it's very humid in your house that day. It's going to be different when it rises. So there are things that you, so to answer your question, Karen, I don't think there's enough difference. I think you could use it either way. I really don't think there's enough difference. And John at the Unpaved Explorer is in. So John, hello, how are you? D Break says, don't give up, Cheryl. You will get it. Just wanted to make sourdough English muffins, and the shapes are not perfect yet. However, taste and texture is good. Bet your pie will be too. Practice. You know, that's what one of my grandmothers told me. Both of my grandmothers were good bakers, but the one I remember saying, you just got to keep doing it, you know? And she was right. All of a sudden, I could feel that dough the way it was supposed to be. And it was like, oh. I discovered Bread Boost, and now I can use regular flour with a teaspoon of Bread Boost. Other things you can add when you're making your bread, because you don't necessarily have to buy bread flour. Do I do sometimes? Of course I do. But there are things you can add that will help activate the yeast in the whole process. You could add a tablespoon of lemon juice, orange juice, or apple cider vinegar. And it will add it. It just helps with the gluten and stuff in the flour, and it can make a better tasting bread. Just one of those things. And Blue is in. Hello. How are you? And John says that he is doing good. Awesome. And Shani says, yes, and I cannot believe how great it works, as I don't need to buy bread flour. See, that's true. Though I have made plenty of recipes. I'll go to my cupboard and I'll decide I'm making bread. I just use regular bread or regular flour, and it has worked a million times. Now, there are certain things that I always use bread flour. Like on Wednesday, I have a video coming out, and I'm making noodles in part of the recipe, homemade noodles. And bread flour works much better, in my opinion, than regular flour in making noodles. So it's just one of those things. Number 4, and we touched on this already. Your kitchen should be warm, but not hot if at all possible. About 70 degrees is the perfect temperature for the bread to be rising, to be proofing. So that, it's just one of those things that we do. Number 5. Now, we were talking at the beginning about sometimes you pull that loaf of bread out of the oven and you just so want to slice it right then. And all of us have done it. If you've baked the bread, you've done it. And it's so good. But the reason why in the long run it isn't good for that loaf of bread is that the inside of bread when it's cooking should reach about 180 degrees. That's like the optimal temperature that your bread is perfectly done. So if you slice it and it's cooling down too fast, that's when your bread will be kind of gummy like. And what also happens, it will get stale and dry faster. Because really when you pull it out of the oven and you sit it on the counter, I usually let it stay. If it's in a bread pan, I let it stay for about 10 minutes and then I pop it out. And then I try to turn it on its side and let it cool. And I'll go back and forth on the two sides. If it's just a round loaf, I just slide it off, put it on a cooling rack, and I really let it sit about 2 hours before I cut it. I want my bread to stay really fresh and moist. I don't want to cut it and then it dries out too fast because it was still actually in that cooking process when I pulled it out of the oven. And I missed. Linda says, I like putting a warm, moist towel over the oiled bowl and dough when it is rising. This is a good trick too. I put it in the microwave, not cooking, so that it controls the proof. A lot of times I have put it in my microwave also. I'm not turning my microwave on, but it just holds the heat that it's actually making within itself because of the yeast that's reacting. And it works really good to proof that. And then when it's ready, I just can pull it out. And so then the fluctuation in temperature, especially if you're doing it and your air conditioner's coming on or your heater's coming on, it just controls that temperature. So that is a great trick also. Comes in a small little bag by the yeast in the store. As my store stops stocking bread flour. See, that's too bad. And there are a lot of stores that, you have to search anymore to find bread flour. It's interesting. It's just one of those things. And Charmaine is in. Hello, Charmaine. How are you? Let me scoot down. I'm sorry if I miss anybody. Blue says, that's why I make my bread in the morning after Tani goes to work. And while it has a good time to cool off before he gets home. Yeah, see, I know we're in a fast-paced world, but sometimes that slowing down and that process of making bread can really connect you and help you kind of clear your mind. You're kneading it and you're working with your hands and you have those smells and that flour, and it can be very therapeutic to make your own bread. Bread flour can be expensive. That is true. Cheryl says, I love the smell of baking bread. Me too. I can't even tell you how many times Joe will come in and he'll go, oh, you're baking bread. Or one day my neighbor came over and she goes, I could smell that bread before you opened your door. What is the best way to store flour? Well, I like an airtight container. Are you talking about storing it for a long time or just storing it so that you're going to use it in the next couple months? If sometimes it's better not to open the bag until you actually need it. I know some people, they'll buy a bag of flour, they open it up and they put it in their Tupperware container with a lid. But if you're not going to use that yet, you're better off finishing your whole container and then adding it to it. Oh, and Carol says both. Now, long time storage, like months and months, some people will put it in their freezer first. It used to be years ago that you would get little bugs in your flour. I seriously have not seen that in decades. I think the whole process of how they make flour now, it rarely happens. But because people are long storing it, a lot of times they'll put it in their freezer to freeze any eggs that are in there. Then you can, I like to put it in some kind of, like if I'm storing a long time, 5-gallon bucket, an oxygen thing in there, Mylar bag. I'm vacuum sealing it and then put it in the 5-gallon bucket. That is long storage for me. Like when I come back from Arizona, all the flour that may be left in my Tupperware, I dump out. Just because if flour sits too long in your cupboard, sometimes it can get kind of an off taste. It'll taste kind of processed. And so I just don't like it. And I figure that flour doesn't cost me very much money, and I'm just dumping it out. Karen says she thinks they need a candle with baking bread scent. Wouldn't that be good? John wants to know the difference between bread flour, baking flour, and all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour and baking flour are very similar. Bread flour has a little additives in there that help with the bread making process. And Julie says, freeze it for at least a week in case of weevils. But anybody in the chat, have you seen any bugs in the last decade ever in your flour? I really think they changed that whole way that they process, because they do not want people, if it's set on the shelf in the grocery store for very long, they don't want any kind of bugs in there. So I think they have changed that. Okay, my tip number 6. Sometimes we think, and I thought this, that I should put a little bit of flour on my hands and then I start to knead. But then I got this suggestion one time that I should get my hands wet and then I should knead. And for me, I think it has made a big difference in my bread making. There is nothing wrong with that stickiness that you're working. And like, I like to mix mine up. I don't use my mixer very often to mix my bread. I do it by hand. First I'll use a spoon or a whisk until it gets too thick. And then it's all hands. And what I found is when my hands have some moisture on there, I can really work it, and I'm adding my flour until I get all the flour in there. And for me, it has worked good. So if you haven't tried that, next time you make bread, instead of kneading it with flour on your hands, get your hands a little damp and knead it and see if you can see a difference. I think it works pretty good. And Julie is right. The gluten level is different. Bread has the most, cake and pastry the least. And I think it does make a difference in the results of how tender your product is when you're done. There are different gluten levels even within all-purpose flour. Different companies, the way they do it, there's different levels, and you can find that out usually from their websites too. And I haven't seen any bugs, but does humidity have anything to do with it? Now, I don't live in a place that has humidity. Wyoming is not humid where I live, and Arizona, where I live in Arizona, is not humid. So could that make a difference? So if any of you guys live a place where it's humid, have you guys seen bugs in any of your flour for the last decade? Just let me know. Do you think kneading it by hand is better than using the dough hooks with the KitchenAid. Now I have dough hooks with my KitchenAid. And I think personally, this is just me, Karen, personally, I think it's better to knead it with your hands. I think that a lot of times we're using those hooks, and I have done it myself. It's not like I haven't used the hooks. But, and pretty soon it's just rolling. It's formed into the ball, and we're plopping it in to our bowl. Sometimes people don't knead it at all after that because they think, oh, it's all incorporated, so I don't need to knead it. I think if you take it out from the hooks and then you knead it still for 10 minutes, I think you're good. But there's just something about it for me that I just love it. I think my bread turns out better, lighter, fluffier. I just think it's fabulous. Tip number 7. I like my loaves a lot of times. I like to split them, or I like to make a curve in the top. Yeah, I like to make a design in the tops of my breads. That's just what I'm saying. Now, when do you do that? Do you do that when you first put it on the cookie sheet or the stone or the bread pan? I wait until it's about 20, 25 minutes before I'm going to put it in the oven. And that's when I do it. It's already started to rise really well, and I'll just take a really sharp knife. And sometimes I'll even run the knife under hot water, wipe it off so there's not water, and then I just slice it. Or I'll make a design. Sometimes I make flowers. It just depends on how artistic I am feeling that day. But I like how it breaks it apart. If I'm making like artesian breads, I like to swirl it, or I'll cut it and make a leaf shape, and then I'll sprinkle some flour, and then when it bakes even more, it spreads it apart more. I just kind of like it. Tip number 8. Now, there are ways to have different kinds of crusts on your bread. Some people like their crust very crunchy or chewy. Some people like it very soft. So if you want a softer crust, you can put butter or oil over top of it. Some people just spray the Pam over top of it even. If you want a crispier, chewier, water is your key. So for my tip number 8, say I'm making a artesian bread. What I do is I turn my oven on. Now, depending on your recipe, you're going to have your oven set anywhere from 375, 425. I've seen some recipes at 500, but I have never baked at 500. But anyway, this is what I do. So I turn my oven on. And I am talking about anywhere from a half hour to an hour before I'm going to put that bread in. I put my cast iron frying pan in the lower shelf. So my cast iron frying pan is getting hot while it is heating up. And then just before I put my bread in, I'm going to pour boiling water into my frying pan. Now, I know some people will take a spritz bottle and spritz the sides of their oven. I have an electric oven, and I'm just not comfortable of spritzing water in there. But the frying pan, you're pouring that boiling water on there. You're putting your bread in there, and it gives you such a good, chewy, thick crust. It's just amazing. So that's just a trick. Julie says, I saw a razor tool you can get to make bread decorations. I am going to look that up because you need a sharp knife. And a razor tool would work excellent because it would just cut through that top layer. Good idea. Good tip. So I kind of combined 8 and 9 because my 9 is doing preheating your oven at least a half hour, if not an hour before. Usually if I'm adding the water, it's an hour before that I'm heating that pan, that cast iron pan. and the oven. If I am just doing a regular loaf of bread, it's about a half hour, because I want my oven to be completely, every corner, that same temperature. And so that's what I want to do. And sometimes if you find that you're baking your bread and it is just getting too dark, I would suggest maybe putting your temperature maybe 20, 25 degrees cooler when you're baking, so that you can do that. And Linda's asking how much. Well, my frying pan's probably 2.5 inches deep. And I pour that boiling water halfway to 3/4 full. And I just want it to steam it. And I just like what it does. Okay. And so my last tip. See, I have a few other things, a few other ones. There are recipes that ask for water. There are recipes that ask for milk. Now, a lot of times we think, oh, we need to have our water warm. But what about those recipes that ask for milk in your bread? I think your milk should be warm. Some milks are scalded and then cooled. As long as it is warm, I think it works good. I have scalded it and I have just warmed it, and I have had good results with both of them. So, but really what you got to do is you got to make a lot of bread. I mean, seriously, you just got to make a lot of bread. And you will get better, and the bread will be better, and you'll get that feel, because sometimes you have problems with your bread. Maybe it's not high. It doesn't rise. What could cause that? If your water was too hot, when you put the yeast in, that can cause it. Maybe you didn't put enough flour in. Maybe you didn't knead it enough. Or you didn't let it rise enough. Those are just things that can happen. And it can make a difference on how your bread turns out. Now, on the opposite, if your bread feels really coarse inside, sometimes you've let it rise too long. Now, it could still be not enough flour, or you didn't knead it enough. But sometimes you've let it rise too much, because it rises up, and if it sits too long, it will start to sink back. And so that can happen. And if it has too much of a yeasty taste, it's not that bread taste. It definitely tastes yeasty. A lot of times that it's risen too long also, or the temperature was too high during the rising temperature, or the rising time. So those are just things to watch out for. And the more you practice, the better, the easier and better it gets, really. But those are really my top 10 tips of baking bread. Now, I did make some cinnamon rolls, and I brought a pan over to my dad's, and we had a couple pans, and my dad says, those are really good cinnamon rolls. And it was probably about a week ago. He said, I'd really like some cinnamon rolls. So I made some cinnamon raisin bread, because Joe loves that. And I made some cinnamon rolls for Dad and us. And I find it very satisfying to make bread. Oh, Shani says, you were going to tell us why not to cut fresh bread. The reason why you don't cut fresh bread is it needs that period of cooling down. Otherwise, your bread will be kind of gummy. You first slice and it's hot, and you're putting the butter on it and it tastes wonderful. But then as it cooled a little bit, sometimes it almost gives the impression that it wasn't done all the way. It's kind of gummy, especially on the bottom half of the bread. And then as it sits, it will go stale, faster and it will dry out faster because you didn't let it cool that really basically 2 hours before you cut it. Now, I honestly have to say that sometimes it's just like we'll be making bread, we'll have a whole bunch of people, and it's like, let's eat this entire loaf of bread. We're just cutting it and putting butter or peanut butter or jam or just honey from the hives. And it, it is good. So I would challenge you guys this holiday season to make some bread. If you have not made bread before, pick an easy recipe and just do it and do it and do it. Just make that same recipe over and over again, and you'll be surprised at like the 5th loaf, and it's all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I can feel the way the bread is supposed to be. Don't get discouraged if you have those days and you're making bread and it doesn't rise or it doesn't do this, or all of us have had those failures. But it's just the way it is. How do two stores homemade bread? How do the stores make homemade bread? It's a huge factory that they're making their bread in. It's just like crazy. And Karen says, you've inspired me to make a loaf this week. So this weekend, after you've gone through the whole Thanksgiving holiday craziness on Thursday, you've gone shopping on Friday, why not make a loaf of bread this weekend? And just breathe, really. Sometimes I get really busy and it's like, I'm going to make some bread. How do I store my bread after it cools? Well, it depends. It mostly depends on the shape of bread that I've made. I have some containers that they're like Tupperware, but they're not Tupperware. And so sometimes I'll put a tea towel down, I'll put the bread on it, and then I close it. Have I put them in Ziploc bags before? Sure I have. I find, it works especially if we're going to use the bread right away and it's all the way cool. But sometimes I have to have a really big Ziploc bag because a lot of times the gallon ones they're not quite big enough. By the time your bread is all, it's raised so high, I have to get the bigger Ziploc bags. But I really like the better putting in the Tupperware like container, and I have the tea towel underneath. I don't want to have any extra moisture in there, so that tea towel will help with that. Since I've been making bread, I don't care for store-bought. Yeah, it's totally different. The texture is different. It tastes different. And I do love toast with homemade bread. Same with Jeannie. Okay, but everybody, I'm going to let you go. I'm way past my half hour. But I had been making bread, and I thought, I'm just going to share some of my tips. And thank you so much for all of the tips that you guys wrote on the side. And Charmaine says, I found a container on Amazon that is for homemade bread. Awesome. I will try to find that, and I'll put it in the link below too. So Charmaine, thanks for that, because I didn't know they had one on there. I'm just using round Tupperwares, So everybody have a great day. I hope you have a blessed Thanksgiving, and look forward to all the videos, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody. And Christine, you are so right. Rolls don't have to cool that long. Bye, everybody.